Hello and welcome back to the Diabetes Summit 2016. This is Dr. Brian Moll, the diabetes coach, certified diabetes educator, and IFM certified functional medicine practitioner. And with me today is the great Alan Christianson. Alan is a New York Times best-selling author and a Phoenix, Arizona-based naturopathic medical doctor who specializes in natural endocrinology with a focus on thyroid disorders. He's the author of The Adrenal Reset Diet, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Thyroid Disease and Healing Hashimoto's, a Savvy Patient's Guide as well. So Dr. Christianson is the go-to for me when it comes to thyroid and adrenal dysfunction in particular, and I am really eager to jump into these topics as it relates to people with diabetes and or blood sugar imbalances. So Dr. Christianson, welcome to the Diabetes Summit.
Hey, Dr. Moll. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really good event, and I'm jazzed to dive in.
Nice. Okay. So let's talk about that. There's lots of there's lots of people who are co-managing these conditions, that they have diabetes or pre-diabetes, possibly they're overweight, and they're dealing as well with hypothyroidism and or adrenal dysfunction. So what's the connection there right off the bat? Because it seems like a pretty common issue to have all of these things going on at the same time.
Yeah. The first part, as far as thyroid dysfunction and thyroid disease, there certainly can be overlap. Stats suggest that maybe a quarter of adults have some active or latent version of thyroid disease. And it totally changes how the body uses fuel, how quickly we transform fuel into energy. So when that's off, it can also change how our liver deals with triglycerides and how well our liver can do backup to manage the blood sugar. So lots of overlap. Adrenal dysregulation, adrenal dysfunction, probably even more common, not great stats on that, but it affects many, and such tight ties into diabetes and blood sugar regulation. The body has a lot of internal ways of managing the blood sugar, and the adrenals are right up there with the pancreas as far as being involved with that. So when their daily rhythm of cortisol spike, cortisol shutoff is not working smoothly, they can't play backup for the pancreas as well, and they can't help manage the blood sugars effectively.
Yeah, really important information. And I'm creating these subtypes for type 2 diabetes, and one of them is type H, which is a hormone type. It's related to all the hormones, but in particular, some of the adrenal hormones like cortisol and thyroid hormone as well. Can you talk about the relationship between insulin and cortisol, and then also if there's a relationship between insulin and the thyroid hormones?
Very much so. So insulin to cortisol, the cycle is that, our meals happen every so often, but they won't happen on a consistent schedule. Our ancestors had blocks of time in which they just didn't eat. And we don't have to eat every hour to survive. We've got internal ways of regulating that. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, so it's a glucose-regulating hormone. And the concept is that all of your hormones from roughly below the diaphragm, a little bit below the waist, they're all modified versions of cholesterol. They're all steroid hormones. So everything from the adrenal glands, the ovaries, the testicles, they're all just tweaks on cholesterol. And cortisol is like that. It's a glucocorticoid version. All the ones from above that area, including the pancreas, it just fits above that line. And the thyroid, the pineal, pituitary, hypothalamic hormones, those are all peptides. So they're all long chains of amino acids. And that affects how they metabolize in the body. But the overlap is such that when your body has a gap between food, you've got to pull more blood sugar into your system. And one of the hormones that does that is cortisol. And so you make more cortisol and you'll pull stored glucose out of your liver, out of your muscles. At some point, if those supplies are gone, you'll use that cortisol to convert your muscle tissue into sugar as well. But you're using it to help make more glucose to keep that there for your brain. Your body can run on a lot of fuels, but your brain is like 92 octane glucose or no go. It's like non-negotiable, so it's got to have that. And cortisol is one of the ways you keep it going again. Now, insulin is working on the opposite end of that. You can think about them almost like seesaws, for example. So insulin is used to pull glucose down. So sooner after a meal, there's a big influx of calories and food coming into the bloodstream. And if it's more than you're burning in the moment, your body uses insulin in a strategic fashion to pull that in to store it. Now, a funny relationship exists to where when there's a lot of cortisol present, because we make more of it in the morning, we make a burst of cortisol to wake us up, we shut it off to let us go to sleep. So in the morning, when there's active cortisol, insulin has the strongest effect on pushing things towards visceral fat for storage. Later in the day, when there's less cortisol present, insulin has a stronger effect upon driving things towards skeletal muscle tissue. So that's a distinction. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But yeah, insulin is pulling blood sugar down. Cortisol is raising it back up again. So thyroid hormones, they're released more so in the morning, but their activity is more constant throughout the day. There's not so much an ebb and flow of how they work within the cells, so they're more constant. And it actually goes over cycles of many days for them. So insulin and cortisol are more fine-tuning moment-to-moment hormones. And they're ones that there's normal cycles, but even within the cycles, there's always room for adaptation and a lot of reasons by which you might need to adjust them per how much you weigh when, stress levels, other factors such as that. Whereas thyroid hormones, they change over longer scales of time. So the body intentionally makes itself more resistant to thyroid hormones when there are various metabolic stressors. And sometimes insulin resistance or blood sugar dysregulation can be one of those stressors. So when your body's not functioning right, it will intentionally slow down its activity so it won't harm itself or create more damage. And that's one of the ways in which your body can become functionally thyroid resistant. And it's actually intentional. Funny thing, I've got a car in the shop right now. It's a newer vehicle and it wasn't expected to be needing service, but the engine light came on. And it turned out it was an oil pump that had gone out early. It was a faulty oil pump. But I noticed when the engine light went off that it was sluggish. I had to really hit it harder to, catch up to traffic in the same way. And I asked the tech about that. And he said, yeah, the oil pump wouldn't have directly affected performance, but there's computers in the engine that slow it whenever there's some compromise detected. I'm like, oh, got it. So that's exactly what happens with thyroid hormones. So when there's something off with your body, such as the blood sugar being dysregulated, you will strategically shift how those hormones work. So not always an accident. It can be an intentional effect just to counter for that.
Interesting. The wisdom of the body there. We certainly notice in our patients or clients that have hypothyroidism, there's a connection with triglyceride levels and cholesterol, at least blood cholesterol. What is that connection, and how does that in turn affect blood sugar?
Great question. Very strong connection. In fact, if you go back historically, we've always been trying to refine and tweak our testing methods for thyroid disease. And I guess it's not been looked at as much in the recent past, but in the prior decades, it was a big topic. Cholesterol used to be a thyroid test. There was a time before we knew that it had some link with heart disease, and it was used to monitor thyroid status because there's a strong relationship between hypothyroid and overproducing cholesterol. And the tie-in is such to where the liver enzyme HMG-CoA reductase, it is stimulated by lower active amounts of T3 hormone. So we dump out more cholesterol. And it's actually a complex web of adaptations as well, but it's counterproductive in terms of cardiovascular risk. And that's consistent with large bodies of data showing that those who are even subtly hypothyroid do see higher risk of stroke and heart attack and heart disease. And a lot of it is from that higher level of cholesterol. You mentioned triglycerides. So the body is taking calories and packaging them first in the form of triglycerides if you've already got your glucose and your glycogen stores filled up, and if you're not burning the calories in that moment. So the thyroid hormones, they're controlling that basal metabolic rate, that resting energy expenditure. And if the food intake is above your needs, or maybe your food intake is totally reasonable, but your metabolic rate is suppressed because of your thyroid being off, one strategy is to form that extra fuel into triglycerides. And that's a transport version of the calories. And they either just get gunked right in the liver where they're made and they can cause fatty liver issues, or they can circulate through the body and cause cardiovascular stress. But the more triglycerides we see within the liver itself, the less the liver can work with the pancreas and the adrenals to help buffer the normal minute-by-minute blood sugar fluctuations. So that becomes a vicious cycle on compounding fatty liver and diabetes.
Wow, that's fascinating. So obviously there's a strong comorbidity with diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So another reason to make sure that we're having thyroid levels checked and optimized.
For sure.
Okay. Now, we often see also with our clients, and obviously this is common in the type 2 diabetes population, is an increase in visceral fat, this larger belly, this larger waist circumference. You often hear that can be related to high cortisol levels. What's the connection there? Does cortisol cause the storage of belly fat?
It does. And we're hearing too that belly fat, we used to think about it like, the hallway closet you threw all your junk in, and now we're hearing it's pretty active metabolic stuff. So it actually makes cortisol. It turns out the adrenals make cortisone, which is a weaker hormone, and then cortisol, which is stronger. So we've always got both of them circulating. And things like the visceral fat, they can shuttle those back and forth as they see fit. So the big concept behind cortisol, stress, visceral fat, perhaps even that diabetic response, these were survival things. These were mechanisms that helped serve us in terms of survival. So imagine that you've got a nice corporate job, you've got a good position, and you just got this some random third, fourth cousin you barely knew, unfortunately passed away and left you this unexpected estate or some inheritance. Maybe you got 100,000 you had no clue about, and it just showed up. Wow, okay, so here's this thing. So next day at work, there's talk about layoffs in your department. And, one of your friends has been on the same team for a decade. He just lost his job because of budget cutbacks. So where does that 100,000 go? Are you going to invest in a new house, like a long-term type idea? Or are you going to put that in a bond? Or are you just going to put that in savings because you don't know if you got a job next week? So that's what visceral fat is. It's fuel that you're putting in the most convenient location because of a time of scarcity. So your body's got some calories, some metabolic resources, and because there's a heightened stress load, and that can be emotional stress, or that can be just dietary stress, or that can be temperature changes or environmental toxins, all these things can trigger that mechanism, but they make your body feel unsafe at a molecular level. And so in that context, you're taking this fuel and your body's thought is, hey, I could just jam that down in the legs and run an extra 5 miles, or I could use that to rebuild some muscle tissue or some bone, or I could hang on to that because there may not be food next week. So that's what's going on. Your body is taking that stuff. Visceral fat, that's like cash under the mattress. That's like the stuff you can get to the quickest in the time of crisis. It's like gold bullion or something. So that's what's really happening. So cortisol, that stress hormone, puts your body into survival mode. Talk about thriving or surviving. So when you're surviving, you're going to hunker down and hold on to what you got. You're going to keep it to where you can access it easily. And the vicious cycle is that visceral fat also is going to make more stress hormone. It's going to take that weak cortisone and make more strong cortisol out of that inside of it. And that in turn will also take fuel away from skeletal muscles. So the cycle that we see is the extremities, the skeletal muscles, they deplete, but that visceral fat grows and grows. And it makes that whole process of blood sugar control and regulation more difficult and more set up to store and less set up to burn.
Yeah, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, that visceral fat is also inflammatory. It triggers inflammation. It can make us more insulin resistant. It can affect the function of our liver and our pancreas. So how do we convince the body then to burn that? How do we convince the body to let go of that reserve, if you will? That's
the trick, right? And I think with the perspective of seeing it as a survival response, I think that starts to make sense as to why just common starvation diets or extreme levels of exercise, why they're pretty self-limiting. Your body's in a state where it's thinking, hey, I might run out of food. And now all of a sudden you're not eating half as much as you used to. So that makes that level of chemical food insecurity that much worse. So the trick to it, a couple ways to go. And I put some thought into this. There's many factors that trigger it. You can't always change all the factors. So I did a clinical trial to see if one dietary strategy could reset that cycle. And we can measure to see how much someone is entrenched in that state based upon their cortisol rhythms, but also on their whole body cortisol production. We measure that via hair cortisol and also 24-hour urine cortisol to gauge what's made outside the adrenal glands. So my idea was, since cortisol is a hormone that's higher when our blood sugar is lower, and since insulin can actually lower cortisol, I wanted to see if by timing foods in a way to where you had more food and more good carb, more very low glycemic controlled amounts of carb later in the day and less earlier in the day, if you could repair that rhythm and move the body out of that state. And, short version of it is we took a group of 42 people who had had at least 5 diets not work in the last several years, and we had them test that out, measuring all the cortisol markers before and after for a period of a month, with a follow-up of 6 months afterwards. And it was pretty cool. We saw that. I actually talked to myself and I said, hey, I don't want you guys to pick up meditation. I don't want you to join yoga. I don't want you to do any one of very many good things you could do that might benefit your cortisol. I want you to do just what you've been doing, no other changes in supplements, exactly what you've been doing, but let's just do this dietary switch. And let's see how the cortisol rhythms change with that, as much as we can, be the only variable. And we saw that it was tricky to measure because in some cases they were making too much all the time. Some were making too little all the time. So I made a numerical score of what an ideal rhythm looked like, and then I made a value of how many points they were above or below that at those various intervals, a composite score of their cortisol dysregulation. And we saw that at the end of the month, regardless of where they started out, they moved about 58% back towards a healthy rhythm just by the dietary change of just, very, very low carb in the morning and never high carb, but just small amounts of strategic carbs later in the day. And so this timing of carb cycling is what I used in the trial.
Wow, that's fascinating. And did you measure any other biomarkers other than cortisol? Did you see weight loss, for example, or any changes in body fat percentage?
Yeah, all the above. Scale weight loss average was about 9.5 pounds. Waist loss was quite striking. The group average was about 2.5 inches of waist loss. But we had a lot of individuals that, they said they had more to lose. They were starting out at a place they wanted perhaps 30, 40 pounds. A lot of them had 4 or 5 inches of waist loss in their first month alone. So that was really exciting. We did see clear loss of body fat, also decrease of A1C scores, measurements of longer-term blood sugar control, by an average of about 0.7 of a point, which is more than most diabetic medications would do, even over a longer time frame. So really exciting changes.
That's powerful. And was that then the birth of your Adrenal Reset Diet book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. The book was really based upon that exact study and took those points out with more clarity and more dieting ideas and more explanation on the hows and the whys. And
Okay, great. So you just quickly described sort of the rhythm of eating and cortisol. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that, but before we jump into that, I'm also curious about some of the testing, because you described a couple of cortisol tests. This can be controversial. There's obviously blood serum tests that are done in basic labs. There's salivary testing that's very popular with functional medicine practitioners and other natural practitioners. You mentioned hair testing and whole body load. Could you describe a little bit about when some of these different tests might be useful and what you think is sort of the optimal way to check cortisol? For sure. You're right. It is controversial, and it's silly that it's controversial, because if you actually look at medical research, it's not. It shouldn't be. But I think some of the earliest concepts in natural medicine about adrenal dysregulation or whatnot, the term adrenal fatigue came out, and it's a very common term. I don't like it myself because I don't think it accurately represents the situation. In this scenario, the adrenals are not fatigued. They're capable of making hormone, but they are intentionally down-regulated. The body is trying to slow them down. Now, I contrast that from adrenal disease. So there's a thing called Addison's disease, which is like the Hashimoto's of the adrenals. That's where the immune system attacks them, busts the factory, and they just can't crank out their products. They can't release adequate amounts of hormone. So that's a disease, and that's a case to where what they do is not what the body wants. And we can see the signals coming to them, screaming at them, saying, hey, make more cortisol, but they're not making any. Now, with this adrenal dysregulation, the cortisol output is spot on from what the body's asking.
There's no disconnect between what you want and what you're getting. You're getting just what you want. So it's not a matter of the adrenals being weak or lazy or broken or fatigued. And I think that got some in the more conventional world initially, resistant to the concept and fighting it from the beginning. But if you look at the concept of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal dysregulation or dysfunction, both of those terms are used in literature quite a bit. There's a ton of data. There's about, I think, 3,500 some odd studies correlating that with various health outcomes and health practices. So this adrenal dysfunction is so real. So now the measurements, the contrast, I set that up because that helps define the measurements. So blood tests, urine tests, especially 24-hour urine tests, generally they're good tools to catch disease. You can catch adrenal disease. There's a few things a little bit more involved, like antibody tests for the adrenals that are through the blood. And there's challenge tests to where we give a microdose of the adrenal stimulating hormone from the pituitary. We give ACTH, and we check cortisol pre and post. Those are all really good tools to check Addison's disease or Cushing's disease, or a few more exotic things like pheochromocytoma or Cushing syndrome. But they don't really catch dysregulation, because with dysregulation, the pituitary and the adrenals are getting along fine, but the timing is off. So to catch that, salivary tests are totally valid and useful. And the distinction that they offer is that they allow measuring cortisol at several different intervals throughout the day and plotting how that person's rhythm looks, how it's working. A few caveats. There are a few smaller labs, many which have gone by the wayside, that are probably less accurate. There are some people to where they've got microscopic amounts of blood in their saliva, and that can give them really goofy results, like all their scores are high in ways you wouldn't expect. So there's a few cases in which it won't fit, but by and large, it's a good tool. When I work someone up clinically, I'll check really all methods so I can compare what their blood level was at a certain time when a salivary level was also collected, just to give a cross correlation with it. But yeah, the saliva shows many samples throughout the day. I did mention hair tests. The adrenals make cortisol, but so does the visceral fat, the liver, and the brain. And early on, many talked about cortisol being a big culprit with diabetes and obesity, but it didn't perfectly fit for some reasons. But more recently, they realized with all this cortisol made outside the adrenals, when you can take that into account, now it really is a smoking gun. So hair cortisol, it's not a sensitive indicator of a daily rhythm, but it's a good indicator of about a 3-week time frame for whole body cortisol production. Whereas blood levels and salivary levels, they will not take into account visceral fat, liver, and brain output. But you can get all of that by the hair. So the perfect study would be, they've done some of this in research where they've done tubes gauging blood output from the liver and blood input from the liver, and they'll give doses of dexamethasone to suppress the liver and the visceral fat from making cortisol, and then they'll give challenge doses of ACTH to stimulate it, and they see how those things change it. And if you could do those studies for all the organs, the adrenals at many points of day, that'd probably be perfect, but that's completely impractical. So the stuff I said is our best option short of that.
Okay, interesting. All right, that's great. That gives a lot of information on how we can actually have our adrenals tested. And it seems like most people with blood sugar dysregulation would want to have their adrenals tested. It's an important factor.
Yeah.
So let's talk then about a little bit more about the rhythm of eating, which you describe in your book, The Adrenal Reset Diet, and how that can affect cortisol levels and then in turn have an influence over blood sugar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I put some thought into this. Macronutrients, we've got protein, fat, and carbs, and just like total food intake. And all these things can influence insulin and cortisol to some degree. But carbs have the biggest influence by a pretty big measure. Fat is the most neutral, and protein is closer to neutral, not quite as neutral as fat is. But carbs have the strongest effect. So, anyone who's had a very overeaten with desserts or like Thanksgiving or whatnot, like tons of carbs, and it's not the turkey, by the way, I won't go into that one in detail, but high amounts of food, high amounts of carbs and sweets, you're sleepy afterwards. So what's going on is you've had a fair amount of insulin production, and that's driven amino acids across the blood-brain barrier to form serotonin, to form melatonin. So you're kind of peaceful, you're kind of like happy and lazy and sleepy. And that's all from that. And to a small extent, that's really healthy when you want to go to sleep at night. You need to have those things occur. In the absence of those, your sleep quality suffers. And we're learning that sleep is totally critical for good blood sugar regulation and good health as well. So a meal early in the day, we want cortisol to have its healthy elevation. So I encourage really building that around good proteins, good fats, and for sure, plenty of veggies that are low in calories work wonderful with that. But the next meal, I encourage about a half a cup of some dense form of very high quality carbohydrate. Vegetable ones are wonderful, things like squash or sweet potatoes. I'm a big fan of legumes. I've seen a lot more positive data than negative data about them cutting diabetes risk, cutting visceral fat risk, but really like a half a cup. Like you don't need a lot of those. There's also this novel category of superstarch called resistant starch, and pretty fascinating stuff. It yields about 7 to 9 hours of stable blood sugar and no big insulin displacement. So I'm a fan of foods that have that. Beans and legumes come up again there, especially the white beans. And there's a few exotic things like, boiled refrigerated potatoes or underripe bananas that have that, or actually banana peels even. But that's a wonderful version as well. So about a half a cup of that with the midday meal. And then for most who are looking to manage weight or diabetes, about 3/4 of a cup with the evening meal. So yeah, really minimal amounts in the morning, up to a quarter cup at the most, and then half a cup and 3/4 of a cup. In the program, many are trying to reverse cortisol imbalances, blood sugar issues. I do really discourage high amounts of fructose. If that super starch is like the best, gentlest version of carbs, fructose is probably the harshest. And, one pitfall about some healthy diets is that sometimes the only carbs they get do come from fruit. And there's a lot of good things about fruit, but if someone's needing to really repair their blood sugar metabolism, they're better off having more glucose and high fiber carbs and less fructose-based carbs.
Interesting. Can you give any more details about that? What is harmful about the fructose with blood sugar metabolism?
Yeah, fructose is more directly metabolized by the liver than glucose is, and it requires just more processing, more packaging, greater risk for fatty liver issues, and also it has a longer-term effect on creating more insulin resistance. So fructose does not initially get metabolized by insulin, but it sets a stage where your insulin becomes less effective, and you need more and more of it to manage the same amount of a calorie load.
Interesting. Now, for people who are dealing with the dawn phenomena, where they have this morning blood sugar high, typically related to cortisol or other adrenal hormones, does that change the recommendation at all? Would that be an indication to try to add more carbs to suppress cortisol, or how do you view that?
In many cases, yeah, good point, the dawn phenomenon. We learned about this with diabetics, and this showed up with us about 13, 14 years ago in the research. Many would go to bed at reasonable control of glucose, and like you said, they'd wake up with higher levels of it. And the first thought was, what, are you sneaking in the kitchen at night? But we realized what was going on was their bodies were overcompensating. So as the night went on, they became hypoglycemic, and that caused their liver to overcompensate by making too much glucose. And in many cases, they also were waking up. They had their mind racing because cortisol was part of that equation for raising the glucose. So rather than get a nice cortisol burst when they should wake up, they might have gotten one at 2 a.m. And their head's like going, oh, I could have said this. I think I forgot that. I should do this tomorrow. And it's just chemical. It's just that blood sugar raising hormone causing all of it. So the earliest versions, before we had a clue about this phenomena, we just saw, good blood sugar here, high blood sugar in the morning. So we would be more aggressive about blood sugar lowering treatments. We'd give more insulin at night. And guess what? It was worse. So then we got the technology of 24-hour glucometry. We got machines that allowed us to track blood sugar 24 hours a day for every minute. And what we saw was the higher they were, the more they dropped earlier along. And so the game wasn't to really push it down more. The game was to keep it stable and steady. Many that I've seen just from the diet as is, because they're getting some healthy carbs later in the day, that can help with it and help offset that curve. Now, there are a few engineered foods that are very dense in resistant starch, and they were first used for a condition called glycogen storage disease. This is pretty wild. This is like diabetes on steroids. So this is a case where genetically people cannot hold on to glucose for any length of time. And it's tragic because 2 hours of no food can mean going into a coma, and sometimes even irreversibly so. So it's so difficult. In '84, a few researchers noticed, they theorized that these slow-burning carbs, these very slow-burning resistant starches might help these people. And they started giving beverages based upon them. And they made some that allowed them to have 7 to 9 hours of stable blood sugar. And that meant you could sleep at night for the first time ever. So that's one strategy as well for nighttime purposes of those, that bad dawn phenomena that persists even on being on the reset diet, is just adding in strategically some versions of resistant starch at bedtime. And it doesn't even take like a large load of food. It can be like 100 calories or so of a dense version of that. And that can be enough to make it to where they're not getting that drop that leads to that morning spike again.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd like to try that with some people and see how it works. The other thing related to that I want to talk to you about is sleep quality, because obviously that's one important factor with blood sugar regulation. And we see oftentimes people who have poor sleep or work shift work have a really hard time controlling and regulating blood sugar.
You said shift work with an F, right?
Shift work, yes. Sorry, I didn't enunciate that.
Some shift workers have told me that joke before.
It's really both, probably, if you think about it, right? So, looking at sleep and sleep quality, how do carbohydrates, especially at night, impact sleep? You mentioned a little bit with the serotonin release. I think that's probably the connection. But then, do you think that's an important factor as well in the blood sugar management?
It seems to be. There's been more data saying that sleep can be a bigger predictor of visceral fat than diet or exercise alone can be. I'll give a little more detail on that pathway and pull turkey out of the fire on that one too. So you hear about turkey, Thanksgiving, and fatigue and grogginess. So the cycle is that tryptophan is a unique amino acid. Insulin, I said how it pulls your sugar into stores. It also pulls all the amino acids into stores. And our proteins are comprised of a large number of amino acids. Some are essential, some our bodies can make. But by and large, they're all pulled away. So imagine a military, there's some new cadets, and they're all lined up, and the sergeant says, okay, volunteers for kitchen patrol, I want you to take one step forward. And all the smart guys take one step back. And there's one guy all by himself who's going to get the mop, So that's kind of what happens with amino acids and tryptophan. So you get a surge of insulin, all the amino acids are gone, and there's tryptophan all by itself. So it's not that you really got more tryptophan, but the relative amount of tryptophan to other amino acids is completely different because of insulin. So with Thanksgiving, turkey is actually a very low food supply of tryptophan. Beef has a lot more, pork has a lot more, chicken's about the same. There's nothing special about turkey and tryptophan. But what happens is you have a lot more food than you normally would, and probably some pie at the end of it. And now all the proteins you ate are now gone. There's tryptophan all by itself. So it's that relative amount of tryptophan to other amino acids that pushes it across the blood-brain barrier. And now you're building serotonin, which is more sedating, more relaxing, more calm, more secure. But you're also going to drive some of that to melatonin, which is that nighttime sleep hormone. So that's a role of having an appropriate good insulin response at nighttime. You want to have that. And I've seen papers saying that if some who are sensitive do go too low in carbs, within 48 hours, they may be losing, an hour or so of quality REM sleep. So we do need some of that response at nighttime.
So if someone's going to add a little bit of starch at night to help with sleep and adrenal health, lower cortisol, blood sugar control, do you recommend that as part of their dinner meal, their last meal, several hours before bed? Do you recommend it as sort of like an evening snack of some sort? And then the second part of that question is, do you think it's important to combine that starch with fat and protein, or how would that affect the metabolism?
Yeah, really good question. In almost all cases, just having an appropriate amount with an evening meal a few hours before bed does have a good corrective effect and does help with that pretty dramatically. And yes, I do encourage combining that with other good macronutrients. In the diet, I suggested having pretty consistent amounts of protein with all the meals, and same thing for the fat, but really just shifting the carbohydrate load. And if you think through closely, if the protein and the fat are the same, but the carbs are larger, that also means the last meal is also the biggest. And some fears that come up. One of us was that, hey, if I eat this and go to bed, I'm going to turn it into fat, right? I'm going to gain fat out of that. Well, I mentioned before about that cycle to where insulin goes to muscle at night and to fat in the day. So think about like the marathon ritual of the pasta dinner the night before the race. It's not pasta breakfast before the race. It's a big lag time between eating something and burning it. It's a lag time of like 8 to 14 hours. There was one really fascinating study on Israeli police. And it was pretty neat because so many diet studies, honestly, they just suck because they're relying on people to just remember what they ate when and report it accurately. And none of us can do that very well, not at all. So this is one of the ones to where it was food controlled. These guys, here's your food. It's all pre-made. It's measured. And not only that, but their plates are measured afterwards for how much they didn't eat. So you knew how much they got when. And what they did was they took two groups on the exact same calorie load of food, the exact same macronutrient ratios, but one group got all the carbs at night and one got them spread out throughout the day. So the carbs at night group also had a bigger dinner than their lunch and their breakfast. It was a larger meal. And what they saw was there was a much greater rate of fat loss. There's a greater rate of weight loss. There was lower amounts of inflammatory markers. There was better glycemic control. And there was also better lipid parameters that showed up just by that difference. So it can be helpful.
Wow, that's really helpful and counterintuitive maybe, or at least counterculture a bit from what many people are taught, like you said, with eating at night and eating carbs at night. So great advice. Lastly, I want to ask you about regulating adrenal hormones through stress relief techniques. So do you have any prescription or recommendation for how to balance stress or balance stress hormones through things like meditation, yoga, and other forms of stress management or stress relief?
Wonderful, wonderful question, and very, very powerful. One thing I would say in general is that there's a lot of data about many practices. So I would encourage someone, if there is a practice, they've got some familiarity, some comfort level, some access to a teacher, or just some means by which that's more likely for them to do. That's the one I'd recommend them to do. The thing that's going to fit is better than the thing that you're going to try and won't stick with. Having said that, another inspiring thing is that a lot of data has shown that you don't have to be doing like yogic hours of training in a cave. I mean, as little as 5-10 minutes a day can produce big measurable changes over brief periods of time, even a matter of a few weeks. Meditative practices are also very simple in terms of their structure. There's been data about the most basic thing, like repeating a word and sitting comfortably, like no more complexity than that, being effective and being transformative. So yeah, definitely pursue some practices. Breathing techniques, yogic breathing has been shown to be effective. Meditation, the two main versions are mindfulness and mantra meditation. So one is where you're trying to maintain focus on the breath or focus on a visualization, like energy centers in the body. And the other is where you're repeating some word or phrase. Both very, very effective. Both can work well. Some have suggested that the repeating a word or a phrase may be more accessible to those who are newer to it, but yeah, equally effective. A great book is called The Relaxation Response by Herbert Benson, and he did some work showing that you could strip away all the complex cultural trappings of meditation, all the weird clothes and all the rituals and all the gurus, and you could just sit down with your back straight and repeat a word that you like. Like it's that simple, and see big shifts in health and in the stress response.
I really like that. That's great. I said one more, but I actually do have one more question that I think is really important to add in, and that's having to do with supplementation, because a lot of people will go to functional medicine practitioners or naturopaths or natural healing practitioners, and they'll be given adaptogenic herbs, or they'll be given adrenal extract for various conditions related to the adrenals. Could you give just a quick primer on the supplements used for adrenal health and where and when they might be appropriate?
For sure. One thing I'll preface with, which is along those lines, but you didn't mention, is cortisol itself. So it can seem really intuitive that someone's got very low cortisol production all day. Hey, just give them some cortisol and make it better. Well, going back to that mindset that I laid out to where it's not broken. Your body could do that if it wanted to. Your body could make that if it chose to. So you can measure ACTH in someone that has stage 3 or very low consistent cortisol. I call that the crash stage in my book. You can measure their ACTH, and it's low. Their body doesn't want more cortisol. And there are cases by which you could give it and you could see them feel more energetic. But there's a lot of things that can really have good short-term benefits, but are moving someone away from their real health and their homeostasis. Cocaine gives people energy very effectively, but it's not going to make you healthier or more resilient. And there's a point at where thyroid, cortisol, hormones, if used with that sort of a mindset, they can be no different than a stimulant. So there are adrenal diseases which are rare, like Addison's, to where that's like life-saving, and I treat that as well. But that's pretty unusual. In most cases, that's not helpful. So, yeah, supplements, adaptogens, wonderful things, and some are very nice, very gentle. One thought I would encourage for any listeners is that when your adrenals are off, it's really different patterns. A lot of this goes back to the work of Hans Selye, and he talked about he was the real pioneer of the stress response, and he argued that at the first stage, you're in this alert response. You're like heightened and you're putting out more levels of a stress response. If that progresses and the stressors don't let up, then your timing becomes altered and your body starts to decompensate and your rhythm goes from here to here. So you're making it, but it's the wrong time. Then if it keeps on going, your production finally falters. He called that the collapse stage. So we've called these stage 1, 2, and 3, or I call those stressed and wired and tired and crashed. And they're pretty distinct. So in one case, your body's intentionally overproducing cortisol. So you want to calm that response. So my concern about many formulas of adaptogens is that there's a booster and there's a slower all together. And you don't really need both. You need one or the other, or maybe you need just more regulation. Maybe it's that wired or tired phase that you're at. So I think they can do a lot better if they're used with a little more specificity. Easy option, Adrenal Quiz is a free resource for anyone. It's in the book, but it's for free online, adrenalquiz.com. And I did a lot of data contrasting many lab values and many symptom surveys. And it's a pretty strong predictor of whether or not you've got dysregulation, and if so, which stage you're in. And once you know which stage you're in, that'll actually give you some free tips on which adaptogens are the best fit for you in terms of like morning and night to help re-level that out again. The last thing you mentioned was the glandulars. And, I don't know, I think independently in many ways. I had a lot of clinical experience. And so oftentimes the things I say are counter to what others say. And I'll throw that out there. And if anything works and it's helpful, awesome, don't change it. But if it's not working, here's some thoughts why. So glandulars, there's no perfect method for removing hormones from glandulars. Many say that they're lyophilized or they're hormone-free. I've got friends in the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry that make prescription thyroid hormones, and they say, we don't know how that would be possible. They don't know how that could actually happen. So there have been assays done. They do have cortisol. They do have pregnenolone. They do have DHEA. They do have some amount of active hormone in them. And if that's known and that's strategic and the body really can't make them, perhaps it's useful, but the difficulty is the amounts may not be consistent. So I know there's this protomorphogen model of them taking them to make your glands stronger, and many have had clinical benefits from that. But they're just not things that I use because I think about them as being hormonally active, where the body really may not want more hormones.
Well, I certainly appreciate your opinion, and you've had a tremendous amount of experience, so it's very valuable to hear that. And what about coffee? You mentioned stimulants. A lot of people are addicted to coffee, or at least enjoy coffee. If someone's dealing with some adrenal dysregulation, is coffee off limits, or where does that fit in?
The further along they are, the harder it is for them. No doubt about that. And the other overlap is that the cycle by which we eliminate caffeine is tremendously different from one person to the next. There's a lot of genetic variation. So, for example, I'm at like the worst end of that spectrum. I'm very slow metabolizer of that. If someone has no sleep issues, really no anxiety problems, and they've got a few cups a day, probably has some health benefits for them. But even the studies looking at health benefits from coffee, some of the more detailed ones have partitioned people out based upon their genotype and how quickly they metabolize it. And they've shown that like stroke reduction, for example, if you're a faster metabolizer, you've got a clear stroke reduction. If you're a slower metabolizer, you've actually got an increase in stroke risk. So anyone who's had issues with their adrenals, especially with insomnia, with anxiety, test it out. Give yourself a 3-week caffeine holiday. Stop coffee, stop chocolate, stop tea for 3 weeks. And if you've had no improvement whatsoever, no problem. Go back to it and enjoy it. But if there's been some change for you, be aware of that and be strategic about it. And some can actually do great to have it most days per week, but they'll take 1 or 2 days off just so their slow metabolism can get caught up on any backlog they've had.
That's a good idea to prevent addiction too, because I'm a strong believer that anything that holds power over us has to go, and for a lot of people, that's coffee. So skip a couple of days, and you'll make sure you don't get addicted to it. All right, Dr. C, thank you so much for all the information. If people want to get more information about you or your book, or your books, I should say, and the things that you do and offer, how do they get a hold of you? How do they find that information? drchristianson.com, CHRISTIANSON, drchristianson.com. Okay, fantastic. And adrenalquiz.com for that adrenal questionnaire, which sounds pretty exciting and useful. So, Dr. Christianson, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Diabetes Summit 2016. I've enjoyed the time with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dr. Moll. I appreciate it.
And for all of you listening, stay tuned for our next session. Remember to keep climbing and to never give up. Thanks, everybody.